Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing our series on Mike Reads reviews with a review of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Before we get started, just some primer so we can get some things out of the way. Sorry for the long hiatus. Started my own business. It's a landscaping company. I'll have more time in the winter to continue on with this channel. And I'll also start off too with the fact that I'm doing this without a script and without my notes because I actually finished this book in April or May of this year, but because of the nature of my business, I just never had time to really sit down, put together the notes for the review, and then put together a review. What you guys don't see on your end is that I usually have a screen that has a notepad file out with my notes for the review, and I don't have that. And that's because I didn't do that at the time, and my memory from 8 months ago or so, 6, 7, 8 months ago, however long ago it was that I wound up finishing this book, isn't as good as it was in the moment. And that's when I like to do my reviews. So I'm doing this review for kind of a twofold reason. One, because I've kind of forgotten the content of the book to a certain degree. So what I'm going to do to refresh myself is just simply read Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom on this channel. So look out for that on this channel in the coming days at most. So now that it's winter, I have time to do this sort of thing. And number two, because I'm going to be doing a reread of the book, I really wanted to have a baseline, something as a way to go back and remind myself of how I reviewed the book before and after, or how I would review the book after, let's say, compared to before. So I've read this through once, and I want to see how my reviews change. Since I usually only do them after a single read of a book, I want to see how my reviews may change after a second read. So with all of that out of the way, this is going to be an extremely brief review, mostly because I don't have my notes in front of me to go over everything. From memory, I did like the book broadly. Well, we're supposed to start off with what it is. And what it seems to be is something of a brief manifesto, and we like brief on this channel, for Milton Friedman's, I wouldn't say worldview, and I wouldn't say for his entire politic, but for his entire theory and thesis on economics and how that bleeds over into his thesis on politics broadly. This is something of a philosophy in terms of how he goes about things. It's not very, very, very specific into his policy prescriptions. So it's more of, so that's how the economics bleeds through into the world of politics, because he takes a very 10,000 feet, a 30,000 foot view of everything with this read. It being a very short read, there's not too much to get into other than to say that as far as the review is concerned, if you really want to get into if you really want a good primer into Milton Friedman, this is probably not a bad start. It reads kind of a lot like a combination of Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies and Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Would I call this the best primer for economics broadly? No. I would say this is something of an intermediate read in the sense that you should probably knock out a few Thomas Sowell books. You should probably knock out Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. You should probably knock out something else by somebody else as well. And this is I would say probably a good primer for Friedman's work and his entries in the 20th century on the subject of economics. I'll say this, though, as we get more into the review of the thing. From what I remember of it, I remember Chapter 1 being just a basic primer, and an introduction to the read, despite the fact that there are numerous precursors to the main body of the read. Chapter 2 is what you want to read. So if you're already really well versed in economics, Chapter 2 is the place to basically start and stop. It's a good place to get some excerpts. And he gets basically everything right in Chapter 2, and he approaches the way he gets to these conclusions by the way that I would do it in Chapter 2. Sadly, that isn't really the case of what happens throughout the course of the book. So, Chapter 1 is basically the introduction to the book. It's the primer to the book itself, and then Chapter 2 is where he lays out his basic theories, his basic thesis. This is the outline of his manifesto, of his roughly 200-page manifesto. Excuse me. Which is written largely in common parlance, so, very easy to read, very, very accessible read. But after he lays out the outline, he gets into the specifics of his theory and the specifics of his takes broadly and his philosophy broadly on economics. And it reads kind of like Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies in that in each chapter he presents a concept or an idea from the perspective of the fallacy of his, let's say, of the other side, if you will, of the economic take. And then he points out the, say, 10 things that are wrong with it. And instead of focusing on the one or two most obvious things and presenting the one or two most obvious arguments against the thing, kind of like what Sowell does, because if you do that, then generally speaking, if you knock off 1 and 2, you can knock off 3, 4, 5, 3 through 10, just de facto. 3 through 10 become moot points. And he doesn't do that. Instead, what he'll tend to focus on is some bit of a nitpick within, let's say, the fallacy that's presented. And then he goes through like the worst series of argumentation to get there. And this is where I wish I had my notes so I could pull out an excerpt and say, listen to this paragraph. Does this make sense to you? And it probably would. But it would be the weakest of those arguments. And again, I wish I had an example in front of me. This is what happens when you don't have your notes in front of you. But I'm doing it on purpose, of course, because even if I had notes, I would have to know what they were referring to. I'd have to have some greater context for them. And since I haven't read this book in a long time, it's probably been at least 6 months. It's almost January right now. I got December 29th. So it's almost January at this point. I don't know when I'll wind up uploading this video, but I'd say it's been at least 6 months since I finished the book. I finished some books as well in the meantime, so look out for those reviews as well. I want to give this book a score like I do, on a scale of 1 to 10, like I have done with every read so far. And quite frankly, I'm not sure how to go about that, because Chapter 10, if it was just Chapter 2 and it was and it was written like a pamphlet, like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, then this would be one of my all-time favorite reads. But then it does kind of a nosedive. The other half of why I have a tough time giving this a numerical score on a scale of 1 to 10 is because it's been a while. So I guess I'm going to pin a number to it for my own sake, so that when I go so that when future Mike reviews this review, we can make a more accurate assessment, a more accurate characterization of both how I have of the read. Not only because it'll be more fresher in my mind, but it'll because it'll be a second read through. So I'm going to go ahead and pin down a 6 out of 10 for Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. There will be a second review of this book as soon as we're done reading it, so look out for that. But for now, that's been my review. Hope you've all enjoyed. See you in the next one.